Prince Sneeze by Harry Beston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alana Jordan. Prince Sneeze by Harry Beston. Once upon a time, a king and a queen gave a magnificent party in honor of the christening of their newborn son, Prince Rollander. To this party the royal parents took good care to invite every single fairy in Fairyland, for they knew very well the unhappy consequences of forgetting to invite fairies to christenings. When all the invitations had been sent out, the queen went down to the kitchen to superintend the cooking of the master dainty of the feast, a huge strawberry tart. The morning on which the grand ceremony was to take place arrived. At 10:30, the court astrologer, who was the master of ceremonies, gave the order to form in line, and at 11:10 the splendid procession started for the church. The road was lined with the king's vassals shouting, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" Countless little elves with gauzy wings watched from the branches of the trees, and the great cathedral bells went clang, bang, clang as merrily as could be. Just behind the royal bodyguard came the king's gold and diamond coach, shining in the sunlight of June, with the king and the queen in it on one side, and the court astrologer and the fairy Titiana, prospective godparents of the little prince, on the other. The prince himself, swathed in wonderful silk, mantle edged with pearls and turquoises, slept in the astrologer's arms. The procession entered the church, where the venerable Lord Archbishop, surrounded by a magnificent choir, was awaiting its coming. A hush went over the great assembly as the parents and the godparents advanced to the flower-decked font, and the silence lasted until His Eminence had sprinkled the prince and given him the name of Rollander. Then the bells rang again, the organ roared so that the windows shook in their casements, and the choristers sang like birds on a summer afternoon. The christening over, the procession went back to the castle, past the waiting rows of bystanders, not one of whom had changed his place or gone away, so superb had been the spectacle. The christening banquet was laid in the great hall of the castle, and thanks to the court astrologer things went off beautifully. It was the only large banquet ever known in the history of the world where courses were served all at one time, and while one other person was finishing an ice, another was not beginning with the soup. Nor was the menu mixed, which happens so frequently today that you are apt to have soup, ice, cake, roast, soup, and a roast again. No, from soup to ice the banquet was a huge success, but alas, disaster came with the strawberry tart. As the queen was chatting with the Lord Chancellor of the Enchanted Islands, she happened to notice, for like a good hostess she had been keeping an eye to the comfort of her guests, that nobody on the right-hand side of the hall had been served with strawberry tart. Almost at the same moment, the chief cook, looking rather pale and worried, bustled through the throng and whispered in her ear, "Your Majesty, the strawberry tart has given out." The queen turned pale. At length she managed to ask in a weak voice, "Have you plenty of other pastries?" "Yes, Your Majesty," replied the cook. "Then let them be served at once." The cook withdrew, and the queen, though somewhat shaken, took up the conversation again. 10 minutes passed, and she was beginning to forget her start, when a voice, rising clear and rasping over the hubbub of the hall, said suddenly, "Where's my piece of strawberry tart?" Everybody turned toward the speaker, an elderly fairy from the kingdom of the Black Mountains, named Malvolia. She stood up in her place, her arms akimbo, glowering at her place, on which an attendant had just deposited a small chocolate eclair. "Where's my piece of strawberry tart?" she repeated. The Queen rose. "I am very sorry, Madame Malvolia," she said in her sweetest voice, "but the strawberry tart has given out." "Hoity-toity!" answered Malvolia rudely. "You mean that you only baked enough for your own personal friends." At this several guests cried "Sh! Sh!" and the King began to look worried. "We will send for some at once," announced his Majesty. "Oh, yes, strawberry tart baked by the Queen's own hands for her own dear friends," said Malvolia sneeringly. "But for me, a fairy of age and distinction, an ordinary low baker's eclair. The kingdom of the Black Mountains has been deliberately insulted in my person." "No, no, no, no," cried the King and the Queen. "We assure you, madam, that it was a simple mischance." "Pish and tush!" replied Malvolia, who, like a great many people, secretly enjoyed feeling herself aggrieved. "I consider the affair an affront, a deliberate affront, and you shall pay dear for this humiliation," she screamed, quickly losing control of her temper. "Every time the Prince sneezes something shall change until—" At this very moment, alas, a northeast wind blew gustily through the open windows of the hall, shaking the tapestries from the walls and carrying away the last of Malvolia's sentence. The angry fairy turned herself into a great black raven and flew, cawing hoarsely, over the heads of the banqueters and out of the window with the wind. A baby's cry was heard, and the King and the Queen rushed, panic-stricken, to where their little son lay in his cradle on a raised platform at the head of the hall. The little Prince's fat, pink face was twisted into dreadful lines. He opened his mouth wide several times and half closed it again, and then, opening it wider than ever, he sneezed a terrible sneeze. There came a loud clap of thunder. When the confusion was over, the court astrologer was found to have turned into an 8-day clock, with a sun, moon, and stars arrangement, a planetary indicator, and a calendar calculated for 2,000 years. The banquet ended rather gloomily, although the gifts of the other fairies, such as health, wealth, and beauty, managed to make everyone a little more cheerful. When the guests were gone, the King and Queen sent for Dr. Pill, the court physician, to consult him in regard to the measures which ought to be taken to prevent the Prince's sneezing. As for the poor court astrologer, he was hung up in the sacristy of the cathedral, and every 8 days his wife wound him up. Tears. "What shall we do, doctor?" asked the King, rather mournfully. "The Prince must be preserved from things which cause sneezing," said the doctor sagely. "Such as draughts?" suggested the King. "Draughts, head colds, snuff, and pepper," answered the leech. "Let his little Highness be put into a special suite of rooms. Admit no person to them until he has been examined for head cold, and has put on germ-proof garments. And as his little Highness grows older, forbid the use of pepper in his food. Better still, if your Majesty has a castle in the mountains, let the Prince be taken there for the sake of the purer air." "There is the tower on Golden Mountain," said the King. At this the Queen began to weep again, for she, quite naturally, did not wish to part with her child. "But, my dear, we can't have him sneezing and things changing all the time," said the King. "I beg your Majesty to consider the danger of a head cold," put in the doctor. "Yes, think of the danger of a head cold," echoed the King, who saw clearer than the Queen the chaos that might result if the Prince